From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Following the call with President Trump, the member of my staff asked Ambassador Sondland what President Trump thought about Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland responded that President Trump cares more about the investigations of Biden, which Giuliani was pressing for.
As the public phase of the House impeachment inquiry begins, U.S. Ambassador William Taylor reveals new details about President Trump's direct involvement in pressuring Ukraine to investigate his political rival, Joe Biden, and his son. We'll hear highlights from the hearing.
Now, there is one witness that they won't bring in front of us. They won't bring in front of the American people. That's the guy who started it all, the whistleblower.
I say to my colleague, I'd be glad to have the person who started it all come in and testify. President Trump is welcome to take a seat right there.
Plus, we go to Chile, where protesters led a massive national strike Tuesday as they condemned the government's plans to rewrite the country's constitution, which dates back to Augusto Pinochet's military regime. And we speak to Code Pink founder Medea Benjamin about why 5 police squad cars came to her house Wednesday in an attempt to arrest her. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. House lawmakers Wednesday opened the first public hearings of the impeachment inquiry into President Donald Trump. 2 witnesses, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State George Kent and William Taylor, former ambassador. They both testified President Trump withheld aid to Ukraine in an attempt to pressure Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden and his son Hunter, who served on the board of a Ukrainian natural gas company. In his opening statement, Ambassador Taylor revealed details about a previously unknown phone call from July between President Trump and Gordon Sondland, the U.S. ambassador to the European Union.
The member of my staff could hear President Trump on the phone asking Ambassador Sondland about the investigations. Ambassador Sondland told President Trump the Ukrainians were ready to move forward. Following the call with President Trump, the member of my staff asked Ambassador Sondland what President Trump thought about Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland responded that President Trump cares more about the investigations of Biden, which Giuliani was pressing for.
Trump tasked his personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, to take charge of foreign policy around Ukraine, sidestepping the State Department. We'll have more on the historic impeachment inquiry after headlines with Liz Holtzman, who is the youngest member of the House of Representatives at the time, and she served on President Nixon's House impeachment inquiry. At the White House, President Trump denied watching the televised impeachment inquiry, saying he was too busy working for the American people. Despite that, Trump tweeted or retweeted about the inquiry more than 30 times throughout the day during a joint news conference with Turkey's authoritarian President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Just after the hearings wrapped up, Trump called on reporters from far-right news outlets, OAN, One American News Network, and Fox News, before demanding a question from friendly reporters.
Would you like to pick somebody?
Evet. Hilal Hanım, buyur.
A friendly person from Turkey, please. Friendly. Only friendly reporters. We like to see. There aren't too many of them around.
President Erdogan's visit came an international condemnation of the recent Turkish offensive into northern Syria, which Turkey launched after President Trump abruptly withdrew U.S. troops from the area, clearing the way for the offensive. Speaking alongside Erdogan from the Oval Office, Trump said Wednesday the only U.S. troops remaining in eastern Syria were there to protect oil.
We're keeping the oil. We have the oil. The oil is secure. We left troops behind only for the oil.
President Trump also claimed he'd spoken with Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, who he said were very satisfied with the change in U.S. policy. The claim was directly contradicted by SDF commander Maslum Abdi, tweeting, "During Erdogan-Donald Trump meeting, Turkish forces launched fierce attacks on predominantly Christian town of Tiltemir, causing massive displacement of the residents in clear violation of the ceasefire agreement," he tweeted. In the Gaza Strip, Palestinians have agreed to a tenuous ceasefire with Israel's military. Israel launched its biggest attacks on the territory in months after the ceasefire took effect overnight. At least 5 rockets were launched from Gaza, prompting air raid alarms in southern Israel, where 1 million Israeli children were ordered to remain at home. Several Israelis reported minor injuries from falling rockets. Gaza's health ministry says 34 Palestinians were killed, with dozens more wounded. Among the dead were 8 members of a single family, including 5 children who were crushed to death when an Israeli airstrike flattened their home. The bombing erupted after Israel bombed the home of a senior member of the Palestinian group Islamic Jihad Tuesday, killing the commander and his wife and injuring their children. In Mexico City, exiled Bolivian President Evo Morales said Wednesday he's willing to return to Bolivia to join a national dialogue after he was forced by the military to step down Sunday in what he's described as a U.S.-backed coup d'etat. Morales blamed the Washington, D.C.-based Organization of American States, the OAS, for his ouster, saying it falsely accused his government of vote tampering in last month's presidential election.
The OAS made a political decision, not a technical or legal one. This is a report. Now I have realized from the recommendations of some leftist brothers and sisters that the OAS is not in the service of the people of Latin America, less so the social movements. The OAS is at the service of the North American empire.
In Bolivia, police fired tear gas to clear thousands of anti-coup protesters from the streets of La Paz Wednesday as low-flying fighter jets roared overhead in a show of force. The protesters were rejecting right-wing opposition leader Jeanine Áñez, who declared herself interim president Tuesday night. The police and military have killed at least 10 protesters since Morales' ouster, with many more injured.
The authorities nearly choked me. They nearly choked me, but I'm going to continue. Bolivia is indigenous.
On Wednesday, Jeanine Áñez swore in a new cabinet and military leaders at the presidential palace in La Paz. Meanwhile, police barred lawmakers with Morales' MAS party, that's the Movement for Socialism, from entering Bolivia's parliamentary assembly. Morales was elected in 2005 as Bolivia's first indigenous president. He says after Sunday's coup, armed men broke into his home in Cochabamba and led an arson attack on his sister's home as well. In Lebanon, government troops opened fire on protesters who'd blocked a road in the capital Beirut late Tuesday, killing 1 man. It was the first death in 4 weeks of massive anti-government protests that have continued despite the resignation of Prime Minister Saad Hariri last month. Protesters are demanding the resignation of all top government officials, early parliamentary elections, and economic reforms. In Zimbabwe, the United Nations is warning 5.5 million rural residents, or nearly a third of Zimbabwe's population, is at risk of food shortages due to a devastating drought brought on by climate change. The head of the World Food Program is appealing for $331 million in emergency food aid, warning, quote, people are marching towards starvation if we're not here to help them, unquote. Wildlife has been affected, too. Tenapi Madiri, Zimbabwe's national elephant manager, said more than 200 elephants have died of dehydration and starvation in recent weeks.
Going into the future with the increased droughts due to climate change and other phenomena, we are likely to experience more and more of this drought, which could possibly impact significantly on our elephant population.
In Australia, the death toll from raging wildfires rose to 4 Wednesday as a group of former fire chiefs said their attempts to warn Prime Minister Scott Morrison about the dangers of climate change have been ignored for months. Greg Mullins, the former fire commissioner for New South Wales, called for the federal government to provide more resources.
But we're also calling on the government to take urgent action on the fundamental problem that's leading to these catastrophic fires, and that's climate change.
In Italy, the mayor of Venice has declared a state of emergency after high tides and heavy winds brought floodwaters to nearly 90% of the ancient city. It's Venice's worst flooding in 50 years and the second worst on record. At least 2 people have died, while the famed St. Mark's Square was submerged by over 3 feet of water. Officials say the floods have caused hundreds of millions of euros worth of damage to historic buildings, many of which may never be repaired. declared. Venice's mayor called the flooding apocalyptic and said climate change is to blame. Scientists predict Venice could be completely submerged by the end of the century if the climate crisis continues at its current pace. Back in Washington, D.C., Chad Wolf was sworn in Wednesday as acting Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. He's the 5th person to lead the agency, which oversees U.S. immigration enforcement under President Trump. Wolf previously served as Chief of Staff to then-Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen as she enforced the Trump administration's zero-tolerance policy at the southern border, which saw thousands of migrant children separated from their parents. The House Judiciary Committee approved a resolution Wednesday that brings the United States one step closer to approving the Equal Rights Amendment, which would guarantee equal legal protections regardless of sex. If approved by the full House and Senate, the resolution would change the deadline for the ERA's ratification, which was initially set as 1982. The constitutional amendment was approved by Congress in 1972 and was ratified by 35 states over the next decade, 3 states short of the required total needed by a 1982 deadline. Nevada and Illinois have since ratified the amendment, and many Virginia Democrats who retook the state legislature earlier this month have pledged to approve it as well. Former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick will formally enter the 2020 presidential race as a candidate for the Democratic nomination. Patrick is managing director at the private equity firm Bain Capital, which was co-founded by Republican Utah Senator Mitt Romney. He once worked as general counsel to the oil company Texaco, served on the board of Ameriquest, a subprime mortgage lender, and was executive vice president at Coca-Cola. Meanwhile, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has refused to rule out another run for the presidency in the 2020 election. Clinton was interviewed Tuesday alongside her daughter Chelsea Clinton by BBC radio host Emma Barnett.
Look, as I say, never say never. And I will certainly tell you I'm under enormous pressure from many, many, many people to think about it. But as of this moment, sitting here in this studio talking to you, that is absolutely not in my plans.
In Little Rock, Arkansas, teachers hit picket lines this morning for a one-day strike, protesting the State Board of Education's decision to stop recognizing their union and to strip teachers of their collective bargaining rights. It's the first strike in Little Rock since 1987. The National Football League has invited all 32 NFL teams to scout a private workout on Saturday by former San Francisco 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick, who says he was blackballed for taking the knee during the national anthem as a protest against police violence and racism. Critics say the move is a PR stunt aimed at absolving the NFL from its act of retaliation and have questioned whether the move will result in a new contract for Kaepernick, who's been out of the NFL since 2016. Meanwhile, Colin Kaepernick drew solidarity Monday from Megan Rapinoe, the star of the World Cup-winning U.S. national soccer team. Rapinoe spoke as she accepted a Woman of the Year award from Glamour magazine.
So while I'm enjoying all of this unprecedented and, frankly, a little bit uncomfortable attention and personal success, in large part due to my activism off the field, Colin Kaepernick is still effectively banned. Still banned from the NFL for kneeling during the national anthem in protest of known and systematic police brutality against people of color, known and systematic racial injustice, known and systematic white supremacy.
And Code Pink founder and longtime peace activist Midvi Engin was threatened with arrest in Washington, D.C. Wednesday and accused of assaulting a sitting Congress member after being forcibly removed from a press conference for opposing the U.S.-backed coup and sanctions in Venezuela. Benjamin vehemently denies the accusation, says she was, in fact, the one assaulted when she and other activists demonstrated at an outside news conference hosted by Florida Democrat Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Florida Republican Mario Diaz-Balart, condemning President Nicolas Nicolas Maduro and announcing the launch of a congressional Venezuela Democracy Caucus. Later in the broadcast, we'll go to Washington, D.C. to find out why 5 police squad cars appeared outside of Medea Benjamin's house. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. The first public hearing of the impeachment inquiry into President Trump was held Wednesday. Trump is just the 4th president in U.S. history to face impeachment. 2 witnesses testified before the House Intelligence Committee: George Kent, a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and William Taylor, a former ambassador and the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine. They both said President Trump withheld aid to Ukraine in an attempt to pressure the country to investigate Joe Biden and his son Hunter, who served on the board of a Ukrainian natural gas company. House Intelligence Chair Adam Schiff opened the historic hearing.
Although we have learned a great deal about these events in the last several weeks, there are still missing pieces. The President has instructed the State Department and other agencies to ignore congressional subpoenas for documents. He has instructed witnesses to defy subpoenas and refuse to appear. And he has suggested that those who do expose wrongdoing should be treated like traitors and spies. These actions will force Congress to consider, as it did with President Nixon, whether Trump's obstruction of the constitutional duties of Congress constitute additional grounds for impeachment. If the President can simply refuse all oversight, particularly in the context of an impeachment proceeding, the balance of power between our 2 branches of government will be irrevocably altered. That is not what the founders intended. And the prospects for further corruption and abuse of power in this administration or any other will be exponentially increased.
The top Republican on the House Intelligence Committee, Devin Nunes, dismissed the hearing as a televised theatrical performance staged by the Democrats.
But we should not hold any hearings at all until we get answers to 3 crucial questions the Democrats are determined to avoid asking. First, what is the full extent of the Democrats' prior coordination with the whistleblower? And who else did the whistleblower coordinate this effort with? Second, what is the full extent of Ukraine's election meddling against the Trump campaign? And third, why did Burisma hire Hunter Biden? And what did he do for them? And did his position affect any U.S. government actions under the Obama administration? These questions will remain outstanding because Republicans were denied the right to call witnesses that know these answers. What we will witness today is a televised theatrical performance staged by the Democrats.
In his opening statement, Ambassador William Taylor revealed details about a previously unknown phone call from July between President Trump and Gordon Sondland, the Oregon hotel magnate who Trump made the U.S. ambassador to the European Union.
Last Friday, a member of my staff told me of events that occurred on July 26th. While Ambassador Volker and I visited the front, this member of my staff accompanied Ambassador Sondland. Ambassador Sondland met with Mr. Yermak. Following that meeting, in the presence of my staff at a restaurant, Ambassador Sondland called President Trump and told him of his meetings in Kyiv. The member of my staff could hear President Trump on the phone asking Ambassador Sondland about the investigations. Ambassador Sondland told President Trump the Ukrainians were ready to move forward. Following the call with President Trump, the member of my staff asked Ambassador Sondland what President Trump thought about Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland responded that President Trump cares more about the investigations of Biden, which Giuliani was pressing for.
During their opening remarks, both Ambassador William Taylor and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State George Kent expressed concern over the role President Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, had in dictating U.S. policy on Ukraine. This is George Kent.
Over the course of 2018 and 2019, I became increasingly aware of an effort by Rudy Giuliani and others, including his associates Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman, to run a campaign to smear Ambassador Yovanovitch and other officials at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv.
During the hearing, Democrats had former federal prosecutor Daniel Goldman leading much of the witness questioning. Here he is questioning William Taylor.
Decades of military service and diplomatic service representing the United States around the world. Have you ever seen another example of foreign aid conditioned on the personal or political interests of the President of the United States?
No, Mr. Goldman, I've not.
Republican lawmakers repeatedly defended the actions of the president. Here's Republican Congressman John Ratcliffe of Texas questioning U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine William Taylor.
The Ukrainian president stood in front of the world press and repeatedly, consistently, over and over again, interview after interview, said he had no knowledge of military aid being withheld, meaning no quid pro quo, no pressure, no demands, no threats, no blackmail, nothing corrupt. And unlike the first 45 minutes that we heard from the Democrats today, that's not secondhand information. It's not hearsay. It's not what someone overheard Ambassador Sondland say. That was his direct testimony. Ambassador Taylor, do you have any evidence to assert that President Zelensky was lying to the world press when he said those things? Yes or no?
Mr. Ratcliffe, if I can respond.
My time is short.
Your time
yes
is
or no?
short. That's right. I have no reason to doubt what the president said and in his.
Okay, very good. So in this impeachment hearing today, where we impeach presidents for treason or bribery or other high crimes, where is the impeachable offense in that call? Are either of you here today to assert there was an impeachable offense in that call? Shout it out. Anyone?
I'm not here to do anything having to do with to decide about impeachment. That is not what either of us are here to do. This is your job.
Republicans also repeatedly called on Democrats to bring forth the whistleblower whose internal complaint prompted the impeachment inquiry. Here's Republican Congressman Jim Jordan, who was made a temporary member of the Intelligence Committee ahead of the hearing.
Now, there is one witness that they won't bring in front of us. They won't bring in front of the American people. And that's the guy who started it all, the whistleblower.
I say to my colleague, I'd be glad to have the person who started it all come in and testify. President Trump is welcome to take a seat right there.
That last voice was Vermont Democratic Congressman Peter Welch responding to Representative Jim Jordan. When we come back, we'll speak to former Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman. She served on the House Judiciary Committee that voted to impeach Richard Nixon. Her recent book, The Case for Impeaching Trump. Stay with us.
Stop your messing around. Better think of your future. Time is straighten right out. Creating problems in town. Rudy, a message to you, Rudy. A message to you. Stop your fooling around. Tie you straight and right out. Better think of your future, else you wind up in jail.
A message to you, Rudy, by The Specials. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Our guest is Elizabeth Holtzman, former U.S. Congresswoman from New York. She served on the House Judiciary Committee that voted to impeach Richard Nixon. At the time, she was the youngest woman elected to Congress. Interestingly, she was replaced in that record by Congressmember Stepanek, who now serves as a Republican on the House Intelligence Committee and was questioning the speakers yesterday. Liz Holtzman's recent book is The Case for Impeaching Trump. Liz Holtzman, welcome back to Democracy Now! What did you find most important about the first day of these public impeachment hearings?
Well, the most important thing was that the facts came out in a deliberate, serious way through the mouths of two highly regarded diplomats who are very experienced and very knowledgeable and who were shocked. They shouldn't be shocked at their ages, but they were shocked and alarmed at what President Trump was doing. President Trump was withholding military aid from Ukraine in order to help him win the next election, the presidential election. And as one of the witnesses said, this is crazy. It's just crazy.
Well, withholding the aid, the allegation goes to force them to investigate his political rival,
Correct.
Joe Biden.
And it wasn't only to investigate his political rival. It was also to investigate whether Ukraine interfered in the election in 2016 instead of Russia. The purpose of this was clearly, even though the intelligence community has unanimously said that it was Russia that intervened in the 2016 election, and even though Mueller has indicted more than 20 people, Russians, for interfering in that election, President Trump believes that it wasn't Russia. Forget the Department of Justice, forget the CIA, forget all the intelligence agency. It was Ukraine. And this is in order to delegitimize the Mueller investigation, remove the cloud of the Mueller investigation over his head, and show him as white and pure going into the next election, as well as getting Biden. That's the other object here. So he had two objectives, both of them personal objectives, and the impeachable offense here, the high crime and misdemeanor here, is that the president used the power of his office, withhold or spend money that was appropriated by Congress, not for the good of the United States of America, but for his personal political gain. And that's exactly what the offense was in the Watergate cover-up.
Well, during the hearing, Congressman Adam Schiff, chair of the House Intelligence Committee, questioned Ambassador William Taylor about a phone call between President Trump and Gordon Sondland, the U.S. ambassador to the European Union.
I would like to begin by following up on something that you have disclosed today and you disclosed earlier to both majority and minority, but it is some new information for the committee. You said in your testimony that one of your staff was present with Ambassador Sondland on the day after the July 25th phone call. Is that right?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
And as your staff related the event to you, your staff member could overhear Mr. Sondland on the phone, could overhear the president on the phone with Mr. Sondland. Is that right?
That's correct.
So the president must have been speaking loud enough on the phone. This was a cell phone, I take it?
It was a cell phone.
The president must have been speaking loud enough for your staff member to be able to overhear this?
It was.
And what your staff member could overhear was President Trump asking Ambassador Sondland about, quote, the investigations. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, I think you testified also that you had come to understand that the term investigations was a term that Ambassador Sondland, as well as Volker, used to mean matters related to the 2016 elections and to the investigations of Burisma and the Bidens. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
So your staff member overhears the president asking about the investigations, meaning Burisma and the Bidens in 2016. And Ambassador Sondland told President Trump that the Ukrainians were ready to move forward?
He did.
And I think you said that after the call, when your staff asked Ambassador Sondland what President Trump thought of Ukraine, his response was that President Trump cares more about the investigations of Biden. Is that right?
And Burisma, yes, sir.
So, Liz Holtzman, your response to the significance of this, I mean, this was new information that was revealed just yesterday in the hearings.
Well, the information shows something we also saw in Watergate, that the President of the United States, President Trump, just as Richard Nixon, was obsessed with getting these investigations done so that he could get help from Ukraine in his re-election effort. That's what, and he was directing this. This wasn't just a one-off, oh, maybe we'll have investigations on, it just didn't, something that slipped out of his mouth. This is something he was obsessed with. He meaning Trump. Trump wanted Ukraine to clear him of the Mueller investigation reports, and he wanted Ukraine to smear Biden. Those were two things he desperately wanted.
Liz Holtzman, I want to go back to Nixon. The articles of impeachment that you voted on, that the House Judiciary Committee passed, let's be clear, Nixon wasn't impeached because he quit before he would ultimately be impeached, but were for cover-up of the Watergate break-in and abuse of power.
Correct. And there was a third one. Stymieing, refusing to turn over material to the House Judiciary Committee and trying to stymie the impeachment investigation.
So I want to ask whether this impeachment proceeding will only be limited to, as Nancy Pelosi said, Ukraine. For example, could it go to issues of children dying on the border? And the reason I ask this is the House Judiciary Committee under Nixon did write up articles of impeachment, didn't they, against Nixon for the secret bombing of Cambodia?
No, I drafted that. That was rejected. But the articles of impeachment about abuse of power went through a litany of things. For example, audits, ordering IRS to do audits of his political opponents. That's what Nixon did. That was one of the articles of impeachment. That was part of the articles of impeachment. Illegal wiretapping of journalists and his staff members, breaking into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to look for information to smear him with. Sounds like Ukraine. That was Article 2 of the impeachment articles, and it also included the abuse of his power to cover up the Watergate.
And why didn't these articles of impeachment that you drafted, they didn't get passed, but the ones about the secret bombing, why weren't they included?
The article about the secret bombing was not included. I voted for it, and a number of others did, but not a majority, because I don't really know the answer to that. I'm speculating, but I think it was not adopted because the chair wanted the broadest support possible for the impeachment articles. And this, because the Vietnam War was still so raw and still matter of such concern, I think the leadership felt that that was going to be too political, and it would make the rest of the articles seem to be political. In other words, policy-oriented as opposed to abuse of power-oriented. I think that was a mistake. But anyway, the fact of the matter is that those three articles of impeachment still are historical and still have never really been attacked, and they are relevant today because we have Trump stymieing and obstructing the impeachment effort. He's got no authority to do that, but he is doing that and just trying to destroy the balance of the checks and balances system. The framers of the Constitution put impeachment into the Constitution to protect our democracy from a rogue president. And he says, well, it's a witch hunt, it's not lawful, not right. That's what the framers intended.
I'm wondering also if a byproduct of this impeachment hearing will be, I mean, you talked about Vietnam and you were fiercely opposed to the war in Vietnam, will be intensifying Cold War ideology in this way. You have the politics of Ukraine. Poroshenko, the previous president, fiercely opposed to Russia, fighting Russia. Zelensky was just recently elected, overwhelmingly beating Poroshenko on an appeasement, or I should say on a proposal to negotiate with the Russians. And now there is a kind of false history being told of Ukraine that they need these weapons to fight the Russians, although Taylor did make the point, not necessarily to fight them, but to be able to negotiate with them from a position of strength. But Zelensky really, the mogul who supported him, who's recently said, really switched sides in a sense, saying we should move much more toward Russia, was about negotiating a peace with Russia at this point.
Right, but I think this gets very complicated because if you stop and think about it, the consequences of what Trump has tried to do by withholding military aid and by trying to force Zelensky to make a public statement about investigating Biden, that would have weakened Zelensky. That would have played directly into Russia's hands. Also trying to show that Ukraine was responsible for interfering in the 2016 election would have played directly into Russia's hand. It would have cleared Russia. So in a way, you could also look at one of the objectives of Trump here is to help Russia.
Well, also, could you talk about, Liz Holtzman, what happened during the Nixon impeachment inquiry, what the effect was on the American public? I mean, did it actually sway opinion against him? Because you heard yesterday congressional Republicans again and again dismissing the inquiry, and Trump, of course, repeatedly forever saying it's a hoax and a witch hunt. His supporters still support him.
Right. And when Nixon left office and resigned, there was still 23% of the American people who supported him, no matter what.
And what ultimately forced him out? Because he resigned before he could be impeached by the House and then removed from office by the Senate.
There's no question. There is no question. Every Democrat and every Republican on the House Judiciary Committee, including Southern Democrats and the most conservative Republicans.
How long did it take the Republicans to switch?
It took the smoking gun tape. But 30% of the Republicans voted for the articles of impeachment before the smoking gun tape came out. And remember one thing that's really important. Nixon was elected in 1972 in one of the biggest landslides in American history. So for people to change their minds, that's what they had to do to support impeachment, because most Americans had voted for him. By the time we finished our work, most Americans wanted him removed from office. Why? Because they saw a fair process, they saw a deliberative process, they saw a process based on solid evidence. And in the end, the American people said, not everybody, but 77% of Americans said, we are not a banana republic. We are, what's more important to us is the rule of law than anything else, than the president, than a party. And I hope that we can come to that conclusion now, that more important than Donald Trump, more important than the Republican Party, more important than any party or any president is the rule of law, and that has to be obeyed here. And the president basically says, I'm president. Article 2 means I can do whatever I want. Article 2 means I can help use all the government powers to win my next election. So what he's doing, violating the Constitution, impinging on our free election system, and that's what Watergate was about. Nixon wanted to get reelected at any cost. That's why there was the break-in. That was the break-in into the Democratic National Headquarters by his campaign people, and the cover-up was related to his reelection effort. Use the government powers, said Nixon, to get what I need for my reelection. What's Donald Trump doing? Using the powers of government to get reelected. This is unacceptable.
I want to thank you so much, Liz Holtzman, for being with us. Former U.S. Congresswoman from New York, served on the House Judiciary Committee that led to the vote for impeachment against Richard Nixon. Her recent book titled The Case for Impeaching Trump. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we head south to Chile. Stay with us.
It's just another word for hunger, taking from you what you need. It's just another word for hunger. When it's time to eat. All around the world.
Imperialism is another word for hunger, from the album A Grain of Sand, performed by Chris Kondo Ijima, Joanne Nabucco, and Miyamoto Charlie Chin. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We turn now to Chile, where protesters led a massive national strike Tuesday as they condemned the government's plans to rewrite the country's constitution, which dates back to Augusto Pinochet's military regime. Chile's Interior Minister announced Sunday the government would draft a new constitution that Congress would then rewrite and put to a public referendum. But protesters say the people should be involved with the rewriting process from the beginning, and that this is an attempt by Sebastián Piñera's government to delay political and social reforms in Chile. This is Piñera speaking on Tuesday.
All political forces, all social organizations, every Chilean of good faith, we need to unite for three big, urgent, necessary national agreements. First, an agreement for peace and against violence, to categorically and undoubtedly condemn the actions that have caused so much violence, and which also condemns with the same strength those who provoke or tolerate it. Second, an agreement for justice, so we can all start together for a robust social agenda that allows for the quick advancement of a more just Chile, a Chile that is more equal and with less abuse, a Chile with greater equality and opportunity and less privilege. And third, an agreement for a new constitution within our democratic institutions, with a clear and effective participation from citizens, with a plebiscite for its ratification, so that citizens do not only participate in the ratification of this new constitution, but that they also have the last word in its approval, and the construction of the new social pact that Chile needs.
Meanwhile, Amnesty International's denounced the Chilean government for widespread human rights violations against protesters. Erica Guevara Rosas, America's director at Amnesty International, said in a statement, President Sebastián Piñera has clearly not taken all the measures open to him to stop the grave human rights violations and possible crimes under international law that have kept occurring in Chile since the beginning of the social protests. This continuity shows there is no genuine willingness to discard a failed strategy or to respond to people's demands and respect their rights, they said. The Chilean authorities have killed at least 20 people, wounded thousands more since the protests erupted October 19th in response to a subway fare hike, and quickly grew into a revolt against austerity and economic inequality. Well, for more, we're joined by Pablo Abufón, a member of the Solidarity Movement, Solidaridad Movement, an anti-capitalist feminist organization in Chile. She's also activist with No Más AFP, an organization seeking to reform the Pinochet-era privatized pension system in Chile. We thank you so much, Pablo, for being with us. Thank you so much for joining us from Chile. Explain what's happening, the mass strike in the streets yesterday, and what the change, what the president is proposing for the Constitution and what the people want.
Hi, Amy. Thank you for having me on the show again. Well, the situation, we're in a crucial moment right now. 2 days ago, we had a general strike, and almost the entire country was paralyzed. All the ports, several very important mines, and also the public sector was completely paralyzed. The healthcare workers and education workers were all striking. And also we had protests in every major city, including massive marches and demonstrations in Santiago. So, and that was after a large sector of organized labor and other social organizations decided to organize a general strike in order to push the government towards basically to stop human rights violations, to take the riot police out of the street, and for a new constitution through a constituent assembly, which has become the main political point of contention right now in the country. And the president, his response, of course, was more of the same. He's basically saying that the same Congress, the same politicians, and the same elite that put us here in this situation should be the ones to write a new constitution. We're not even sure that he's talking about actually a completely new constitution, because we haven't seen the actual details of the proposals, but they're saying that maybe it could be just some constitutional reforms. And also, his response on Tuesday night was more repression, basically. He claimed that they were going to use what they call the anti-terrorist laws against people who were protesting, but also not just people who were protesting, but people who would call to violence, as they say, directly or indirectly involved in the marches and demonstrations, as they say. And that seems like a way to say that they're going to prosecute individuals and groups that have been involved in the marches and demonstrations.
Well, I want to turn to a particular kind of violence that's been deployed against protesters in Chile. Concerns are growing over the number of protesters who've suffered the loss of an eye after being shot by police pellet guns. According to some reports, at least 200 people have been treated for eye injuries, which have often resulted in blindness in one or both eyes. The New York Times spoke with patients inside an eye trauma unit in Chile.
He opened fire. A pellet hit me in the eye. The police grabbed me by the hair and dragged me to their truck. They started taunting me that I'm going to lose my sight, one less eye. The pellet is still inside me right here.
It's inside your eye now? Are you scared? Scared that you could lose your eye?
But I know that God will restore me to what I was before.
So that's a protester who was shot by a pellet gun at very close range. Pablo Abufam, could you talk about this, what you know of the police deploying these kinds of guns and the number of protesters who've been injured?
Yes, so this is so cruelly and tragically symbolic. We have been chanting for almost 4 weeks now that Chile has awakened, and now that people have opened their eyes, that we have opened our eyes, the police are basically taking our eyes off. And the National Human Rights Institute has at least 200 reported individuals who have been shot in the eye. But we've also known from the Association of Doctors that they have received pressure from the government not to report or to underreport those cases. So we still don't know how many people have lost their sight in one or both eyes, as you said. This has been very common during the past weeks, and we were already used sort of to the tear gas and water cannons by the riot police. But now we've seen another level of violence against protesters and just people walking down the streets during those demonstrations. They're shooting old people, young people, even kids. And we all, as of now, we all know someone who has been shot by one of those pellet shotguns by the police. And it seems like they're testing new repression tactics. So this gives us a sense of what the government and what the army and the police are thinking of this situation, is that it's a testing ground for new tactics of repression of civilians.
And what effect has the ouster of Morales in Bolivia had on the protest in Chile, if they have? And at this point, what do you see happening, Pablo?
Well, there's no clear notion of what the Bolivia situation has on Chile right now. Because as you know, the protest movement doesn't have just one leadership. There are a lot of movements, organized labors, the feminist movement, the environmentalist movement, but also a mass of people who are organizing in popular assemblies in their neighborhoods. And the political debate it's everywhere. You can see people talking about a new constitution, talking about the economic policies that we need for a new Chile, basically. And the situation in Bolivia feels like a tragic turn of events for many people, as the right wing and the extreme right wing are taking advantage of a political crisis in the country.
What was the effects of Michelle Bachelet coming, now the head of the UN High Commission on Human Rights, former president of Chile, who herself and her mother were tortured under Pinochet? Her father died in custody.
Well, actually, Bachelet didn't come to Chile. She sent a committee, but we still haven't heard anything from that committee yet. But the human rights situation is very difficult right now, because the police, the director of the Carabineros of the police in Chile is saying that he is not gonna expel any officer involved in human rights violations. An audio was leaked, and then the institution confirmed that he said that he was not going to expel any officer involved in human rights violation. That's terrible, because we see that there's a situation of that the riot police, the armed forces in our country, are not being regulated by any civilian authority.
And Pablo, in addition to the number of people who've been wounded, there have also been over 5,000 people arrested. Can you talk about what their situation is and what prospects there are for a hearing or for their release? Or are some of them being released, have been released?
Well, we had a report, the last report from the National Rights Institute was 4 days ago, and that was before the general strike on Tuesday. So we can guess that there are at least 2,000 more people that were detained in the past 4 days. We also have, today is a very important day. It's 1 year after a Mapuche young man was killed in the south in occupied indigenous land. And so today is going to be a day of demonstrations and protests, not only in Santiago, but also in the south. And this is very interesting, because what the Mapuche have been living in the south for 500 years is something that we are seeing right now in a militarized Santiago. So what's happening with the detained is that some of them are being released. Some of them are being withheld in jail during the investigation of their charges. And we see that as sort of like a political punishment for being part of a protest. Because, of course, a lot of those people, they haven't been even involved in anything. They are just being taken off the streets by the police. So basically, the police are acting as a political police, taking people off the streets as a way to normalize the situation.
30 seconds, the demand now.
Sorry?
30 seconds. What is the demand now?
Well, a constituent assembly is basically what people are asking. The government is talking about the Congress rewriting the Constitution, but people in their popular assemblies in their neighborhoods are talking about a constituent assembly, of people being involved in actual rewriting the base of our social agreement of our Constitution.
Well, Pablo Abofón, we want to thank you so much for being with us from Chile, member of the Solidarity Movement, the anti-capitalist feminist organization in Chile, also active with No Más AFP, an organization seeking to reform the Pinochet-era privatized pension system in Chile. When we come back, why did a squad of police cars show up at the home of Code Pink founder Medea Benjamin? This is Democracy Now! As we turn now to our last segment.
Code Pink founder and longtime peace activist Medea Benjamin was threatened with arrest in Washington, D.C. Wednesday and accused of assaulting a sitting Congress member after being forcibly removed from a press conference for opposing the U.S.-backed coup and U.S. sanctions in Venezuela. Benjamin vehemently denies the accusations and says she was, in fact, the one assaulted when she and other activists demonstrated at a press conference hosted by Florida Democrat Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Florida Republican Mario Diaz-Balart, condemning President Nicolas Maduro and announcing the launch of a congressional Venezuela Democracy Caucus.
Medea Benjamin joins us now from Washington, D.C. Medea, what happened yesterday? Start with the beginning of the day. Where were you? What were you doing? And then what happened next?
There was a press conference being held outside to announce the creation of this new Democracy Caucus on Venezuela. And so we decided to go with our signs saying hands off Venezuela, no coup. And the Venezuelan opposition elite showed up as well. We know these people very well from the time we were part of the Embassy Protection Collective trying to stop them from taking over the Venezuelan embassy in D.C. They are thugs. And it's important to understand, Amy, that this is not about Nicolas Maduro. This is about the policy of intervention that we are opposing. And the creation of this caucus was yet another piece in that. The U.S. is paying for the salaries of a parallel government that they have set up. And these people showed up at the press conference yesterday, and they push and pull. They grabbed all of our signs. They grabbed the phone out of the hands of one of us. And I was pushed and shoved and choked and thrown to the ground. And then later, I was accused of being the one to assault Congresswoman Deborah Wasserman Schultz. And there was a bulletin put out for my arrest. They showed up my house, 5 cop cars, plus police on motorcycles, and they threatened to arrest me. I was very intimidated, and I must say that I feel that this is par for the course because, unfortunately, the police, whether it's the Capitol Police, D.C. Police, or Secret Service, have always been working hand in glove with the Venezuelan opposition. And every time we get assaulted, which is unfortunately on a regular basis, we ask them to be arrested. The police won't do it, and instead we get charged.
So explain what happened. They came to your house, like 5 squad cars of police. They attempted to arrest you, but what happened?
Motorcycles. Well, I asked where the warrant was for my arrest, and they didn't have the warrant. And they waited and waited, and they said that their detectives were looking over the footage that they had. And I said, good, look over the footage, because you'll see that I was being choked and thrown to the ground. And then after a time, they said, all right, you're free to go. Now, I don't know if that really means free, because we have the case of Max Blumenthal that 5 months after being at the Venezuelan embassy, they came and surrounded his home and did the same thing, put him in jail for 20 hours, and now he is facing court charges for a false assault arrest. We have the 4 people from the Embassy Collective who are facing very serious charges for upholding international law. We have my own partner who, for 6 months, had his passport taken away, had to report to court every week until they finally dropped the charges. So I think people should know that there is a systematic attempt to intimidate those of us who are standing up for international law, standing against U.S. policy of intervention, going back to the days of the Monroe Doctrine, standing up against the very brutal sanctions that are hurting people in Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, and that we need more people to join us in this and get our elected officials to speak out. Right now, Bernie Sanders is the only one doing it. We need the other candidates to do so. We need our Congress to do so, to say, stop the U.S. interference in the internal affairs of other countries.
Medea Benjamin, your sign said no coup in Venezuela or Bolivia. We just have a minute, but talk about your concerns yesterday.
Well, my concerns is that this new bipartisan caucus is going to turn up the screws even more. And let's face it, they don't care about the people of Venezuela. If they did, they would lift the sanctions. What they care about is the votes in Florida. And that's why it's bipartisan. Florida is a very important state in the upcoming presidential elections. And that's why we have to stand up to the thugs, the elitists, whether it's around Venezuela or Cuba. It's not about those governments. It's about the principle of non-intervention, and I call on people to join us to say, stop the U.S. government from going back to the days where it thinks it can impose governments on other countries.
And they are saying, as you stood next to, and we're looking at video footage, you're right next to Congressmember Wasserman Schultz. You're saying the Venezuelan opposition behind you took you down on the ground?
They did. They choked me and they threw me down to the ground. I'm in pain. I couldn't sleep last night. My whole side is in pain. So they definitely were the ones that grabbed me and choked me and threw me to the ground. I guess they didn't arrest me because they saw that, and maybe they feel they would have to arrest the people who assaulted me. But once again, I do feel very intimidated, and I don't feel like this is the end, that they could show up at my house anytime with a warrant just to keep me in this process, like they have done to so many of our other comrades, to try to stop people from standing up for this principle of non-intervention.
Medea Benjamin, we thank you for being with us, co-founder of Code Pink, longtime peace activist. Happy birthday to Ishmael Daro. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks so much for joining us.